Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about all the different ways that you can use stamps, stencils, and ink to create fun and exciting artwork. Now, as you can see, I've created a lot of greeting cards with mine, but you can certainly use these tips, tools, and tricks to apply them to art journaling or other mixed media art. Rubber stamps and ink and stencils are great additions to your art arsenal of things that you can use. So hopefully I'll give you some great ideas that you can use for your next art project. So if you're interested in find out how, stay tuned. Let's get started. So welcome everybody to inks, stamps, and stencils. That's what we're going to be talking about this month. And hopefully I can dispel a lot of confusion about different types of inks, and I'm not going to obviously be able to cover every possible option tonight, but what I want to do is just cover, basically give you an idea of what you can do with stamps, inks, and stencils. And I'm going to show you some examples of to maybe motivate you to learn about them. Even if you're not making cards, I'm going to be showing greeting cards because I've used it a lot for that. But if you are doing any kind of art journaling or mixed media, stencils, stamps, and ink are always a wonderful addition to any mixed media or art journaling. So think of it outside the box, if you will, or outside of the greeting card. I'm just showing you because this is the history of how I've used it most. And so I can show you the most options there. So I'm just going to show you first, these are some of the cards that I've made using stamps, inks, and or stencils. And I will get into more techniques next time, but I just want to have you have an idea of where you can go with it. It can be very, very simple, or you can have fun. I don't know if you can see the watercolor effects, but you can have some fun watercolor effects. There's great depth and texture using some different types of ink. I'm hearing clicks on my phone, so you can make your own paper. All of this paper was completely white before I created these. Now, not the yellow background, it was actually yellow, but most of these were white, and I either colored the paper or created my own designer paper, which we will do at some point. Oh, actually, that's upside down, like that. So you can see there's quite a range of designs and things that you can get, looks that you can get with using inks. And you can think of them a little bit like watercolor, but there's also some features that are very much like acrylics, depending on which techniques you're using or which ink you're using, what materials. And some of these, those of you who are in my previous card making class probably recognize some of these cards. So as you can see, there are a lot of variety of designs that you can make with them. And so I'm going to just start with looking at some of the supplies and hopefully giving you some information about what to use when and where. So probably many of you, if you've done any kind of stamping or heard rubber stamping, the first thing you're going to think about probably are these. Okay, so what you might be thinking of if you're thinking of rubber stamping are these old block types. Usually you're thinking about this pink rubber on a block, and basically it's pink rubber. And then there's a little foam layer that's between the rubber and the block, and then the block. And that is, you know, kind of the old school original style. But as you can see, these take up a lot of space. They're kind of bulky. So of course, things have come, you know, further in creating more space effective stamps, if you will. And this is one example of just something that has been made. It's just on some thick craft foam, and then it has the red rubber, and then they just have a label on top. And so that's a little bit, you know, a little bit easier, a little bit thinner. And the reason you have the foam is because when you're pushing down, you want a little bit of some cushion to make sure that it presses, evenly. And that gives it a little like shock absorber that helps it, all the parts of the stamp to touch the paper. And so you can either have, the foam on this side of it, or you can have it under the paper, which I will show. Now, this is I don't even know if they carry these storage containers anymore, since the block stamps are kind of, fewer and far between nowadays. But this was a great clamshell style acrylic or plastic storage. And what I liked about it is it's the size of an 8.5 by 11 page that you can fit in there. Like, it's big enough to be able to house that. And then I just took a blank sheet and then just stamped all my stamps on there, so I can quickly and easily see all of the stamps that I have in this particular storage container. And then I label the front. I have them labeled. I have sentiments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And then I can also, if I printed out any, because sometimes I'll use printed sentiments, I can fit those right in there with them. So I can put similar things. Maybe I've made some pre-stamped some things or images, and I can put cutouts of those in this container. So I do like this storage container for the wooden blocks. Just a little FYI while we're looking at those. The next up is they've taken that concept of that rubber stamp, and they've completely just removed the block part of it. So now you have the stamp, the rubber stamp, still the rubber stamp, and it's got the foam behind it, but now it has a cling stick film that's on it, and that'll stick to pretty much anything that's non-porous and smooth, like acetate here. I've even used, sometimes I'll use a stamping container. If it's pretty smooth, it'll stick to that. After a while, sometimes that tackiness can soften up and they'll fall, and you don't want that, because if you've already finished a project, you don't want it dropping on your target. So you can add a little bit of tackiness. You could put some tacky spray on there, some kind of repositionable adhesive on the back to kind of reactivate that tackiness, or just don't put it on a block. Sometimes I just stick it straight on there and then I just press the block over it. And if it doesn't stick to the block, I just, if it's not sticking to the block, it's not going to pick up and then drop. If it does pick up, but then it drops, that's a problem. So you don't want that. So if you are doing it this way, you can just kind of peel it off to make sure it's not going to lift and drop. But basically you use these acrylic blocks. They sell these in different sizes and shapes, and it saves a lot of space, because instead of all those wood blocks, you can just have one acrylic block this size for all your stamps that fit that, and then you can have one this size for a little bigger, and then maybe a bigger one, just to accommodate all of your clean stamps. So that's an example of it's still the rubber, which is maybe of all of the options that are out there, this does probably the nicest job of giving a good quality stamp. And I'll explain why in a little bit when I talk about the other options that are out there. But and that's why some places still use this even with the clean. There's pros and cons to everything though, right? So that's an example of a rubber stamp, but it's a cling stamp, so it can be used with the acrylic block. Now you're going to hear acrylic stamps or clear stamps. That's another option. However, not all clear stamps are created equal. So they might look the same pretty much. If you looked at these side by side, you'd probably, or even, not side by side, you'd probably think, oh, they're clear stamps. They're made from the same thing. Now, when you look closer or you feel them, then you'll see the difference. This one is made from silicone, and that is a cheaper material. And so oftentimes that's why things are made with the silicone. The problem is, and these are old, so you'll start to notice this used to be really clear, just like this is, but it started to get a little bit yellow. Now that doesn't matter. The yellowing doesn't matter over age. This might yellow too. I don't know. This is older. But what happens, I was just trying to pull this off of the acetate, and it started ripping. It actually started deteriorating, and it's very sticky to the touch, which means that it does adhere to the ink real well, but it also it's just real gummy, but it also is really flexible. So it squishes really easy. So if I were to use this and I pushed it a little too hard, it might actually flatten out the shape and create a little bit more blobby, less defined, less clear shape. It's even leaving like a stickiness on my fingers. So while this option is cheaper, now oftentimes you're not going to see what it's made of on the actual packaging, so you have to do a little bit of research, and it's hard to tell when it's in the package. But the photopolymer, which is the other higher quality clear stamp, is a lot shinier. You can see how shiny that is. I mean, even in the packaging, I could notice that compared to this. This is a lot duller in appearance. And when you open it, you will smell a little bit of some, chemical smell to it just from the processing of it. And it just doesn't, it does have a stretchiness to it. It's sticky, not as sticky as that. It does have a pliability to it, but it's not as much as this one. Like I could really stretch that one out of shape. So this is going to take a lot more pressure before it gets misshapen. So you want to be able to press down decently and have it give you a good shape. And you can do that with the photo polymers. So that's the difference. They're, like I said, they're not all the same. So just keep an eye out. If it's really inexpensive, it's probably this. And like I said, this is not going to hold up great over time. I mean, this is, I don't know how old this is, but just be aware of that. Now, I've had some of my rubber stamps for way longer than this. And the one thing that happens with the rubber stamps, the red rubber, is that can harden and become brittle over time. So, but even with that, even when I've used my hard stamps that have hardened, I've been able to still get the shape. It's not going to be as cushy. You might need to put a little bit of some foam underneath the paper to have it, press a little bit better. So I just have a little bit of a sheet of craft foam that I'll use to stamp over. And I use that with my photopolymers as well, just because they don't have the cushion. They are a little squishy, but I don't want to do, make this squish too much. So I just put the paper on top of this, and then I stamp onto the paper with the acrylic block. And this will stick to either of these two, the silicone or the photopolymer. All right. Then there are other features that you might find in some stamp sets, pardon me. Some of them are layering effects. So this one, it has basically the base color, which typically you would put the lighter color and then a darker color, medium value, and then a dark value, and you get for the details. So you could layer them. They'll look like a watercolor or something a little bit more intricate, a little bit more dimension. But it's very easy to do. All you have to do is, stamp your base and then stamp your detail. And so it's a really easy way to get some layered dimensional looks without having to know how to create that with artistic ability. So that's a nice feature. They also have stamps that come with a matching die. So a die is basically, and this is a metal, it has a little blade, a metal shape, and it cuts out the paper to the shape of the stamp. So I could cut out this, or I could stamp this butterfly, and then I could put it through my die cut machine. Now, next month, I'm going to be talking about embossing and die cutting and all of that. So I'm not going to go too much into those this month, but just be aware that there are sets that have that option. You can just stamp and then cut it out. Now you can also do fussy cutting, which means you cut it out yourself. You can stamp first and then cut it out. But this just is a little bit of a shortcut. So that's a nice option as well. And there are some, a little aside, I feel like I'm losing my voice. You can also use die cuts, depending on how they look, as a stencil. So I use this to, it's not really coming in too much with the lighting, but you can see the little butterfly shape. So I just put this butterfly on, and then I did some stamp stencil stamping around it. So I like things that have multi-use because I have limited space and I want to be able to do as much with what I have. So I like the double duty things. Now, here's another example of that. This one is a background stamp. A background stamp is usually a larger stamp. It's more of a pattern or something that will look good on the background of a card. It's good for making your own designer paper, for matting, or for lots of things like that. And this one actually comes with, I say, see emboss, and it also has an embossing folder. And again, I'll explain how this works next month, but this will basically create dimension on your paper. So you can stamp it first and then line it up here and create a dimensional or embossed image that has pigment in it as well. I also tried out using it as, well, again, if you're going to see that because the light is still too bright. I was trying to make it really low, but it's a very subtle version of this pattern. No, it's still not really showing great, but you can see it's a little, it's there. Now it's starting to come in. It almost looks like it's outlined, even though I put the ink all over the shape. It printed very differently, but it's another way you can use these embossing folders. And again, I'll go into those details next month. You can also create your own stamps. This one I did a long time ago, and it's with linoleum, these linoleum sheets. This, you basically have a sheet of linoleum. It feels like rubber, and you have a carving tool and you carve out the white space basically. And so you can basically make your own stamps that way. I don't have any more of the materials to make this because, you know, I just have plenty of stamps, and I decided I was going to have to let go of something. So, but that's an option. And then you can also just use things from around the house that have any kind of shape or dimension, texture. This is a drawer liner, for example. So I can just use this, press it into my ink, and then make this pattern. So try different things, especially if it's kind of rubbery. That'll just make the ink stick a little bit better. When you're using acrylics, acrylics stick to things better, so you can use just about anything that has a pattern, but ink is a little bit different. It doesn't stick as well as the acrylics unless you use the pigment ink, which I'll talk about in well, very shortly. I'm just going to go into inks now, but try anything, test it out, anything with texture. You can use bubble wrap and all the things that we talked about. For acrylics, you can try and see how they work. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is ink. And the two primary ones you're going to find out there, there's some variations as well, and I'm not going to cover all of them because that would be overwhelming. But the one that you're going to see the most often is usually a dye-based ink. So dye, if you think about hair dye or clothing dye, it's more of a stain. It's a staining type property. So it's more liquid and it absorbs into the porous surface of the paper. So it works really well to stain your paper. It is, and this particular one is water soluble. It stays water soluble just like a watercolor would be. So if you do wet it, it could smear. Some of them have a little better, resistance to that, but they are water soluble and they remain activatable once you've stamped. So if you're going to be sending holiday cards and it's raining and snowy and your mail carrier isn't that careful, you want to be aware that, you could have some problems. You may want to add a fixative over something if you have a great design that you don't want to get, to get wet and bleed. Now, Distress ink is another water-based dye ink. This one is a little different formula. Now, there's a gazillion different formulas out there. There's different brands, different levels of quality. They behave different. So test out what you have. But I know that I have pretty good luck with my Stampin' Up! And this is great also, but for different purposes. Now, Distress ink is designed for creating textures and special effects. It's for creating like a grungy look or a background, to make an aged look, that sort of thing. So it's designed to use blending tools, not designed necessarily to do stamping with. You can do stamping with it, but it's just probably not going to give you as defined a print of stamp as you'll get with some of the other dye inks that are designed specifically for that. And I'm going to be showing you and using all of these different things. Now, this, for example, can also do blending and distressing, but it's not going to be as effective for that. This works better for some watercolor techniques that I'll be showing. So they can do the same kinds of things, but one works better than the other for a particular technique. Another type of ink that you'll find that's very common and very popular is the pigment ink. And just like with the paints, how it is a ground up pigment powder, and it's mixed with some kind of binder or some liquid to kind of hold a vessel to kind of hold the pigment together. This is made usually with a glycerin base. So it's not water-based, and so it behaves a little different. While this stains the paper and absorbs right into the paper, this actually will sit on top of the paper. So it will be a little bit more permanent once it's set. You can heat set it to make it a little bit more permanent. So I kind of think about like watercolor versus acrylics in the ink world, if you will. It's more opaque, it sits on top, and it's also stickier. It adheres a bit better. So if you're using some of those photopolymer stamps, this is going to stick better to those stamps, and you're going to get a better coverage than if you're using water, which doesn't really stick to plastic real well. It wants to pull up. And so sometimes you'll get a variegated look if you're trying to use the photopolymers with a water-based. So if you do have a lot of photopolymers and you're wanting to do stamping with those, I would recommend considering the pigment ink. Now, sometimes it's not clear what they are. If it's not labeled, it's probably a dye-based, because that's the most common. But if you're not sure if it's missing the label or something like that, like this doesn't say anything, but there are ways to tell besides the label. Now you'll notice that this pad is, well, mostly white because I've used it a lot, and I've probably contaminated, cross-pollinated it with some other colors a little bit, just maybe a dirty stamp. And you'll notice that this is a bright green, and these are both foam rubber pads. And if you look at the dye inks, this is going to be a felt pad. It's going to be harder. If you push on it, it's really firm, and it's dark. You cannot tell what color ink that is. This is a bright green, maybe not as bright as that, but it's still a bright green. It doesn't look any different. Now, this particular Stampin' Up, they do use a dense foam rather than using the felt. So this is a little bit different version. So you may see that, but you'll notice if you can see between these two types of foam, this is maybe like a more open cell, like you can see the holes in it. And because it's going to let that pigment, it's a little bit heavier and thicker, it's going to let that rise to the surface. And this is very smooth and shiny, even though you can, push into it easily, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be as, you're not going to see the holes of the foam. So the containers that they use are different. And that's one way that you can know for sure, what you have. Now, the great thing about the pigment ink is, like I said, it's more opaque, so it sits on top of the paper. So this is great when you're wanting to use it on colored cardstock. I would not be able to put a white water-based dye ink on top of black cardstock and be able to see it, whereas you can with this. Now, not all colors work well, but usually you can get you can see that versus if you were using the dye-based. Now, another one that is dye-based but is not water soluble is the permanent waterproof archival ink. Now, I don't know for sure. I don't know what the base is. I'm guessing this might be even possibly an alcohol base. It says water-based dye, but this is a water-based dye that is waterproof. So once this is set, it's not going to smear or smudge. You can use it on top of alcohol inks or with alcohol inks. I think if you really rub the alcohol on it, it might smear it. And I do use alcohol to wash it off of my stamps, but it's just going to be really hard to get that to move. So anytime you're going to want to stamp the frame of an image that you want to then later color, I would use an archival, or not necessarily this particular one, but I love this one. It's very popular, but a permanent waterproof ink. And not all black inks. I mean, it was interesting because in some of my fountain pens and things like that, there was one that was an art pen, and I thought, okay, that's going to be waterproof, but it wasn't. I put it down, I let it dry, and still I wet it and it's smeared. So just check your ink before, especially if you're going to be doing any wet work on top of it. You want to make sure that it's going to be, stay permanent. All right, there are hybrids between the water and the pigment, and I don't have any of those to show, but basically they have some of the properties of each of those. There are also different formats that you're going to find the ink in, like not only on a pad, but with some of the higher end brands, you're going to find that they also have a marker line with the same colors. And those are really nice, especially if you want to do detail work that matches. It's nice to have the option to have a marker that you can use to get the detail. And the other thing you can do is you can actually use markers for stamping. So if you want not all one color on a stamp, you can use a marker and just color one section. Let me just give you a brief example. I'll be demonstrating this eventually, but let's say I want this part of it to be green, and then I want down here to be blue. If I'm trying to do that with a stamping pad, that's going to be really hard to do. I can possibly like kind of stamp it up there, but I can't really get much detail. I can maybe sort of do that and then try to put the other color over here, but you might get a rough line, or maybe you want colors kind of close together. So you can do that with markers. You just you basically color it, the colors you want. And then usually I just do a little huffing on it with my hot, moist breath, just to kind of activate it a little bit right before I stamp it if it took a long time to color. So you can use any water-based markers to do that with. It doesn't have to be ones that match your inks or that are related to that or the manufacturer. It could be Crayola, whatever you want, but you can still do that effect with the markers and rubber stamps. Now, if it's water-based, again, it's going to stick a little bit better if you're using the rubber stamps as opposed to the photopolymer. But there are ways to try to get the photopolymer to stick a little bit better, and I'll talk about that. Another format that it comes in, if you have a higher end quality brand, they're going to have re-inkers. So you can buy this separately, so you don't every time have to throw away your ink pad and then buy a whole new ink pad and waste all that plastic and all the material to make that. That's pricey. So you can save a little bit of money and just, reduce waste by getting re-inkers and then re-inking the pads. So these can also be used for other techniques too. It doesn't have to only be used to re-ink. So it's basically just a liquid eyedropper, basically filled with the ink. So I'll be demonstrating some other fun techniques that you can use these for, but they're also great for just re-inking your ink pads. This is the one that I have for the archival ink, so that has one as well. And I have heard that some of the pigment inks also have re-inkers. I don't have any of the re-inkers for those. I just have the ones for mostly just for my Stampin' Up. Now, there are also water-based inks that come in sprays. This is one of my favorite brands. It's just, the colors are just vibrant. It's got little metallic in there, and it's beautiful. And this one is by Lindy's Stamp Gang, and this one's actually Bells of Ireland Green. But I don't know if you can see like all of the iridescent and metallic in there. Those can create some really cool colors and metallics. Now they come in matte colors too. They don't all have to have shimmer, but I really do like the shimmer sprays, and you can spray, especially using them with stencils. They're really fun. You can either just spray them onto a project directly, or you can use them through stencils, and that's great. I like to, as with all of my pigmented medium, I like to create a color swatch sheet. So I just do little swatches of each of the colors. This is my Stampin' Up selection, so I can quickly look at what colors I have to choose from when I'm working on a project. And these are some of my spray inks. So you can see Bells of Ireland. See how it even has like a little golden halo, and it's real shimmery. It's not a cool color. So, so I have a variety of spray inks as well. And then I just have some various, well, these are my distress inks, and just a mixed bag of inks that I have. So this is just nice to just go to. I don't start by going to my supply. I start by looking here and seeing what colors would make sense for my project, and it saves me a little time. I also try to mark the ink pads. One of the challenges is that most of these containers are stored with the ink pad up. And for me, I think that it's best to keep them upside down, because any of that ink is going to then go to the bottom of the ink pad if I'm storing them upright like this. And so I feel like if I store it this way, I'm going to get it to move more closer to the surface of that ink pad. So I like to store them upside down, but as a result, I don't get to see the color. So what I do is I have a little label that I put, that I actually just colored with the ink. I put it on the side, and then I stack them upside down, and then I can see the color quickly. And I also mark it on the bottom of it, so I can see it when I'm working with it. I can see the color. The cool thing about the Stampin' Up pad is not only is the lid attached, so you can't lose lids, because that can happen if you get busy and you have craft supplies everywhere. But the cool thing about it is that when you store it, you'll notice it goes upside down. So this is the upright position of this container, and the pad is actually upside down, and that's a nice feature. Another cool feature is that you can, because I use it a lot for some painting techniques, you can kind of press this. It's a little bit flexible, not too hard. But if you press it a little bit, you're going to get a little bit of the ink right in here. And I use this as a water palette mixer. So I can just, if I'm going to be painting a color, I can dip my brush in there and it's ready to use. So it's just a nice little extra feature. Now you could do that, you know, if I wanted to do it with this, I can't really touch the top of that. So I can't really put it in there. I'd have to daub it and then put it in there and then use it that way. But usually what I just do, if I'm going to do something like that, where I'm going to do a watercolor technique, is this is a silicone mat that I have on my workstation, and I can just put it right on the silicone mat and then pick it up from there. So there's always another option. And I've heard people use pigment inks for watercolor techniques. I haven't tried that. I've usually used the water-based ones, but as you can see, it really picked up pretty easily with that. So I think they work fine. And I'm going to be demonstrating some of those options when I do my demonstrations of techniques. For cleanup, I like to have a microfiber. This is actually a cleaning pad that I got at a dollar store, and you can see I've used it a lot. I think this is permanent. That's the permanent ink. But I just wet it. You can either wet it with water, or if you have a stamp cleaner, they sell stamp cleaners out there, you can spritz a little bit of that on there. Just has a little bit of some cleaning solution. Or if I'm working with the permanent, and this is my permanent side, I just use alcohol to clean up the permanent. I don't always clean off the stamp. If it stays on there, if it's black, it's not going to come off the next thing because it's permanent, so I don't worry about it too much. But if you don't like your stamps to stay black, you know, you can do that. All right, so I've covered the inks. Now let's talk about what to stamp on. And I'm going to be demonstrating a variety of papers.
Shauna, do people also use like baby wipes to clean.
Yeah, a lot of people use baby wipes. I just try to use something that's, you know, reusable. But yes, baby wipes, a lot of, especially some of them have alcohol in them. And those ones that can help, especially with the permanent stuff. Some of them don't. So it depends. And then sometimes they can leave some fibers on it, you know, depending on the quality of the baby wipes that you use. So just be aware. You don't want the little pieces of the fibers to stick to your stamps when you're stamping. Just make sure you check, because I've seen where, you know, I'll clean it off and there's like these little fibers. And then when I go to stamp, I've got like these fibers sticking off. So just be aware. But yes, absolutely. You know, a lot of people do like to use I used to use baby wipes a ton. As with any medium, the paper does matter, and you're going to get different effects depending on the paper that you use. I'm going to be demonstrating a bunch of different paper types, but and I'll explain what my favorites are and why and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to talk about some of the things I'm going to be demonstrating. This is a watercolor paper. So there are some watercolor techniques that I'll be demonstrating. And like, for example, this one is a watercolor technique, that middle part right there. So this is all watercolor paper. Now you can do some watercolor techniques directly on some cardstock. So I'll probably demonstrate on both and just see how the effects go side by side. But I will be using some watercolor paper. This is 140-pound cold press. I also have, this is a gloss photo paper just from printing in your you know, old printers. They a lot of times I find them at the thrift store. There'll be packages of them. People stopped printing photos, so you might find them at thrift stores. Vellum, another option. This is printer paper, which wouldn't be what I would suggest, but I want to demonstrate how things look on that. It's really thin printer paper, and also really thin sketch paper. Again, it's not real smooth. It's probably going to bleed, I'm guessing, but I thought, you know, it'd be fun to just try out some things on them and see how they fare compared to other papers. Now, my favorite paper for years has been, and I've shared this a number of times, is the Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock. And this is 80-pound. And I love this paper. It's very smooth. I use it with alcohol blending. I use it with stamping. I use it with card making. I've used it for a lot, you know, Zentangle, a lot of projects, and I love this paper. And I've heard some other artists talk about the 110-pound version, and I thought, well, that might be good for card bases. It's a little stiffer. Like, oh, this isn't real stiff. So I thought, okay, 110 might be a good weight. And I was starting to get low on this. I thought, okay, I'll just invest in the 110, and then can use it for either design the card face designs, or I can use it for the base, or at least I can use it for the base. And if I want to do a design on it, I'm still going to have quality cardstock. Well, I have to say, and I don't know that this probably won't pick up on camera, but I don't know if you can see that, but the color, this color is a little warmer white than that is. And I don't have a problem with this being not as cool white as this. I actually don't, I like this color. But the biggest problem, and I don't even mind that that's a cool white and that's different, but the biggest problem I have is that I can see a texture on this paper. It's supposed to be smooth. When I look at these labels side by side, the only difference on here is 110-pound versus 80-pound. It says finish is smooth. It's solar white. It's classic crest cover. I don't see any other differences except for in the weight and in the number of sheets. And yet, to the visible eye, I can feel it's more textured. It looks more textured than this. And it's not the same color. So I was actually quite disappointed. I can still use it for a card base, but I just really hoped I could have it for multiple tasks. And I just don't know that it's going to work as well for doing my designs on. So I'm going to try it out and see how it looks. But I'm a little bit surprised and disappointed at that. And I don't know if they've changed their formula. I don't know if I got a bad batch. I don't know what the deal is there. So, but I really like the 80 pounds. So at this point in time, unless I have more information, I wouldn't recommend the 110. There might be a better one out there. This is a Stampin' Up! Whisper White, and it's very, very smooth, very, very nice silky texture, or lack of texture, I should say. So more like a hot press. If you're talking about watercolor paper, you want it real smooth, because what happens with the inks, because it's a dye, especially with the dyes. Now, this isn't as true if you're using the pigment ink, and that's why it's important to know which ink to use for what. If you're using a textured or a more porous surface of paper, the pigment ink might do better just because it sits on top of it and it's not going to just absorb and bleed. But if you have a real porous paper and it has a good texture, it's going to bleed out just like kind of watercolor does, because there's a lot of water in the pigment itself, and so you could get some bleeding, which is going to distort the shape of your stamping. So just being aware of that, and that's why I really like that smooth, the smooth Nina Classic Crest cover stock. And this is a mixed media, so it's not quite watercolor. It's supposed to be okay for watercolor and acrylics, pen and pencil. So I'll play around with some techniques on that as well and see how those fare. I tried a couple watercolor, and it does okay. It's probably not as good as the watercolor paper does. So, which is what I would expect, because it's thinner, first of all, and it's not designed specifically for watercolor. So, but we'll try out some things on that. And then I also have just some, I don't even know what brands these are, some colored gray and black, because I want to show you the pigment. And then this is a Stampin' Up! And I think this is Crumb Cake, if I'm correct. And this is not as smooth a finish. This is more like the 110 pound Nina Classic Crest. It's got a little bit of a texture compared to the white. And it's, I think that, you know, these are designed more to use as the card base, and the white is designed for, you know, doing a little bit more techniques maybe, and that's why it's smoother. I don't know, but it definitely is not as smooth as the Whisper White is. All right, so those are the papers. Hi, sorry to interrupt the program, but I just wanted to remind you to please like, subscribe, share. There are links down below for some of the supplies that I've used if you're interested in checking those out. Now let's get back to the program. And now we'll just talk about using stencils with ink. The cool thing about working with ink as opposed to paint is that it's not as wet, unless you're using, of course, a spray or a real, you know, liquid bottle. But if you're using it with a dauber, or, you know, with a sponge or something like that, it's not going to run. So you don't have to necessarily have stencils glued down or shapes glued down. You can even just use, you know, a paper guide, and still you're able to get the stencil effect. So that's a nice option. These, I think, are actually, I don't know if these are designed for stencils so much as they might be for embossing, I believe, which I'll show next month how to do with them. But I can also use them as stencils, because they're basically a really thin sheet of metal with shapes on them. So anything that's really thin and has a shape opening, you could pretty much use as a stencil. You can even make your own stencils out of die cuts. So I just took a piece of acetate and some of these punches. Let me try to see, make it so you can see. I kept both sides. I kept the innie and the outie. That makes sense. Okay, so you can see the shapes that I punched into them. So I can either use that as a stencil and get the flower shape, or I can do the reverse. I can do the negative space of that. So I kept all the pieces, and I could just put the piece down and then shade around it. So I can either make the shape white or make the shape color, depending on how I use it. So that's a fun And this was just, like I said, taking these punches and then just punching around a piece of acetate. And I think this acetate was like, you know, back in the day when they did projectors, I think I just found it at a thrift store or something, but even packing material sometimes has some acetate in there. If it's thin enough that you can punch, this is pretty thin. You can also use those plastic page protector sheets. Those would work too. You just want a plastic. You can use paper as well. It's just that once you use it, it's going to kind of fall apart. So especially if there's a delicate design, paper is going to be harder to work with, because as soon as you add that ink, the petals are going to start to dissolve a little bit. So it's not as easy. This is punchinella, which is basically what's left over after they make sequins, and they sell them like ribbon, and that makes a nice stencil. This is a big stencil, which doesn't seem like it would work, but you could take a portion of it and make a cool background. So even though it's a large stencil, you could still use it for a small project. This is a type of stencil that has a sticky background. So if I peeled this wax coated paper off, it would be sticky, and that's designed to be able to stick it to a project to paint. But I want to reuse it, so I'm not taking that off. Some of them, it has just a piece of acetate there, and you have to peel it off of that, and so then it's hard to use because it's sticky. But this one actually cut out the shape, so I can just use it as is, and I can just make it a stencil that's reusable. The other way, it's not really reusable, because once you have the sticky side out, it's hard to protect that side. And then of course there's just the standard stencils. They come in all sorts of different patterns. This is the cast off from, I bought these bricks that are paperboard, and so I made a stencil out of that. Now this is thicker, and this isn't as good for using with ink and stamps, because it's a little trickier to get into the depth of this. This works better for trying to do texture type stenciling like we do with acrylics. But I mean, I could make it work. It's just probably not as good as thinner sheets are. And you'll find that there's different thicknesses in the stencils that you buy. Some are pretty, some are pretty thick and some are very thin. And either way, it'll work. It's just that thinner probably is a little bit easier when it comes to using with inks. You can make your own stencils. This was just using a hot glue gun on a non-stick surface. I actually used a heat resistant silicone pad, and I just basically did a little squiggle, and then I created a little grid. This is actually sticking to this one. Yeah, so out of hot glue. And then you can also just cut out your own stencil. This is I think a cereal box, and then I just primed it and sealed it with some varnish so I can reuse it, because you can't clean it real well if it's paperboard. But even if it's for one project, you could do that, where you cut it out of some paperboard and then you use it, and then you're done with it. And then just try out other things. Anything that has a pattern, give it a try, see how it works. This is leftover construction material from the 70s. This is for the needlepoint stuff. This is for grilling fish, and this makes a fun pattern. So think outside the box as far as stencils go as well, and they're a lot of fun to play with. All right. Another tool that's really handy to have is a brayer roller. And you can even just roll the ink from the pad onto the page and get some interesting techniques. So the one that's in the middle of these sizes is, if you're going to pick one, I would say that one. I don't have that one yet. I have the very small and the very large, but I would say the one that's about 4 inches or something is a good size to have. But this does make some fun shapes. I think I used this for, creating the background of this. I did stencils and just rolled the color on. So it's good for covering a big, wide larger area quickly, either of these. Although this is going to get messy if you have something small, because it's going to overlap, and I think it's just going to be messier. So I did actually order the small one, because I really feel like That one's too big for most of my projects. Just an example of using the alcohol inks with stencils on the glossy photo paper. So you can get some fun background effects. I could use this as a decorative paper behind another theme, or, you know, there's just lots of ways that you can make some great backgrounds, especially with that. And then you're going to want to be able to blend a lot of these backgrounds, like this, for example. I'm basically just masking off shapes and then using a blending tool to lay down the pigment. So that's a really handy tool to have as something that can blend. This is another example of that, creating this background. You can also just put some pigment around the edges and create some fun effects that way, or just to finish off the edge. The background of this is actually white cardstock that I just basically put pigment on. It's all ink. It's on the background. And then I just put this on top. So being able to blend is really important. And I have, for my Stampin' Up, I have a dauber, one of these foam daubers for each color. And there was even a set at the time that I bought it. There was a set that, or somebody had a printout or something that had all of the labels of the colors, and it even had the color on it. So that's kind of handy. I like these for detail and for deep color, but more recently they started using brushes like makeup. These are actually used to be foundation brushes or makeup brushes. They're really, really soft, really fine bristles. And these work great. I really like how you can go from very, very light, you could just dust it on, or to go to a deeper color. I think these it's a little bit trickier to do a lighter shade. It's a little less control. I think these you can really do more subtle. Now these probably wouldn't be as good to use for, well, you could try it, but I don't know if these would work as well for the pigment ink, since that's a glycerin base and it's going to kind of leave it sort of sticky. So I have never tried that. I think maybe the foam would work better for that, but just make sure that you have a designated brush for your pigments if you're going to try that. And then have, you know, designated daubers for your, you know, pigment and also for your dye. I wouldn't probably mix those just because, you know, the base is different. So let me just show you an example of what that looks like. And again, how this works is going to vary depending on the paper that you're using and whatever ink you're using. One of the distress ink is really designed for this. This is designed to be used to do that. And I think I don't know if it doesn't absorb as quickly, or, you know, maybe it's a thinner ink, and so it lays down a little bit easier, but I do think that this works a little better than some of the other inks. So let me just show you an example of what that looks like. I do have these marked with just some acrylic ink to show which color. I have like the different color families. You can't see this acrylic because it's too dark. It's green though. I can tell it's green in certain lighting, but I think I need to put a brighter green. So I'm going to start, this is green. So I'm just going to take this, even though this isn't for my Stampin' Up, it doesn't matter. I'm just picking a similar green just so I don't change the color of it. But I'm just going to dab it on here. And then I have this silicone surface, so I can do it right on here. And I start on the edge. And sometimes I'll dab it off a little bit just to make sure there's not like too much or it's kind of blended in there. And then I just start rotating and going onto the page. Now be careful if you're using your mat. If you set this now on top of that and you're using this other side's going to be visible, that green is going to show up there. So just if you're kind of touching the mat, just be careful not to move your paper onto it. That's the danger of doing it that way. Some people like to do it on top of a piece of paper. That way it doesn't get on your project because it absorbs into the paper. But this just allows you to kind of use most of it. So, all right. So I'm going to just start rotating, and then I'm going to go on to the page and just lightly. So this is a great way. You want to edge the paper just, you know, to create a border around it. And also, if you don't have colored cardstock, you can basically just do the color around the page and then put your design element over the top of it, and they're only going to see that the edge. And that's what I did here. I basically did this over around the edges and created the border that this sits on. You don't have to see the whole thing. And then you can bring it as far as you want. So you can make a whole colored cardstock if you want. Okay, now let me just show you that with the brush. Same ink, same paper. All right, so I'm going to dab it onto the ink. I'm starting here and I'm softly just moving on to the paper. And see how much lighter, I don't know, I think it's even washing out because it's so light, but I can get a really light coating of that. And I'm just, you know, here, it's hard for me to go real light. This I can really easily just make the whole thing a really, really light lime green. And then I can add another layer if I want it darker. I just feel like you can, you know, get a little bit more control with these brushes. I started on the page and that's why I got a little bit of a blotch there. That's why it's good to start kind of on the outside and move in so you don't put a big amount of pigment right in one spot. And if your paper is not real smooth, this might look blotchy, you know, more blotchy and things like that. But yeah, I really like how smooth that goes on with these paddle brushes. It's really, it has a nice feel to it. All right, now I want to do that with a different, it's still a dye ink. All right, now I'm starting from the edge and then I'm just working my way onto the page. Now it's always a little bit darker on the edge. And the more you go around one area, it's going to get darker, you know, so you can go lighter first and then, you know, bring your pressure up if you want to try to reduce that. If you don't like it darker along the edge, I like a dark edge, so I don't mind. You can do that with either of those. You can see light and dark. I mean, this one, I think the distress inks work better for blending, but I think that they just give a more even coat typically, but you can do it with either. And I don't mind it having the different variations. I think it kind of looks cool. And what I was talking about with doing the masking, now this is a sticky note that's sticky all the way through, like the whole thing is got the tackiness to it. You could use a regular Post-it note or sticky note, doesn't really matter too much. It's just that I like it to, it's nice if the edge, whatever edge you're going to be using, will stay down and doesn't move on you. So these work really great for that, and they're a little bit bigger. So I can create this really interesting mountain range or whatever. And if it's sticky, I don't have to worry about holding it down, which is nice. And because it's, like I said, pretty dry, it's ink, it's not going to, you know, dissolve my paper. I can use regular, you know, it's not even cardstock, just regular thickness of paper. And I'm going to start on the mask and work my way to the edge of the mask. And so you can either, I don't know if you guys can see that real well. You can either be making white peaks if you're trying to make like snow capped with a green horizon. Now, obviously green is not a great for horizon, but if I was making snow, I could make that like a blue background and then this would be snowy hills, or I could make reversed. Those are little green hills. And then I can move this around a little bit Or I could take the other half of it and put that in there, different place, and then create some more layers. And you're just gonna like subtle layers. And it's just a really easy, basic. Oh, I did it reversed. I should have done it this way. But anyway, you can see how that works. Let me do it this way. Okay, so you can get layers and layers of fun hills. And I'll show you with just a regular Post-it. Now, what I typically do is just tear it at the, I'll tear it near the sticky part so that I have at least the edges sticky. And then I might do a line of them, you know, so if you don't have a little bit of stickiness, I can't make as big of hills if I do it this way, but so you can kind of bring them together to make, you know, more subtle hills. I didn't make it subtle because I didn't start. That's what happens if you don't start on the page first. When you start hurrying. Okay. But it's actually kind of fun with the different thicknesses. So you can have a lot of fun with masking. And even if you didn't have the sticky side, you can cut whatever shape you want. You could just hold it down and it's still okay. You know, it's still going to work. It's just that it's a little easier if you have it stuck to it, but you could just tear paper. You don't have to necessarily have it sticky. Look how fun that is. So that's a one just basic technique, and that's why it's good to have, you know, some blending tools, just because it's going to give you a lot of variation. And again, you can find, I think I got these at a dollar store actually, in the makeup section, but they sell them online. You can get a whole like 12 of them for $13 or something like that. And so let me just show some of these stencils again. The stencil, you can use the brushes with the stencils. Again, you don't have to necessarily have it stuck down, but just hold it real well. And let me get, I'm using the green, stick with that. Again, just holding the stencil down. I can use the brush, or I can use the dauber. And then I have another cool texture. Check that out.
Very cool.
And this is a little more delicate. So probably for this one, I'm going to want to do more daubing rather than brushing, just because I'm going to probably move that around if I try to use the brush. So I'd probably either move to my dauber. Now I have these homemade daubers. Not all of them work great. I'm going to show you these options that but you know, you can use, of course, makeup foam can work. And then this is actually art sponges. Just it's usually comes in a disc, and I just cut it into these wedges and stapled some paper onto it and then put the ink color that I'm going to use. So these can work. This is actually a furniture floor protector. And some of these do give a texture that I don't really like. So, you know, try things out, but anything that's like, you know, kind of fibrous, or, you know, like this is Velcro glued onto just a wooden block. And I use this side to make shapes, and then I use the Velcro side. But again, you want to be able to rotate those. And for this, I don't think that's going to be easy to do. So I'm going to use just a stencil brush. Remember, I use this for the watercolor, but I can also use this for delicate for daubing. So I'm going to try that and see how that works. It's going to give it a little texture. So that's pretty cool. Now I could also try out one of these daubers and see how that works. I just have to be a little bit more gentle because if I rub too much, that's gonna, this is kind of delicate, so it's just won't be able to handle that because it's very lacy. But I can just kind of dab, and I don't get as smooth. I get a little bit of texture, but I think that's kind of fun actually. So that works as well. And then this is that construction, which I've used this one too before. I'm going to use this little sponge to get that shape. And then this one, I think I'm going to have to use a brush because it's a little bit thicker. So it's going to be hard to get through there. So I'm going to just use a regular stencil brush and see how that works. I have to kind of punch it in there because, like I said, it's a little bit thicker. But yeah, that gives me a cool texture as well. Like I said, you can play around with your DIY stencils or this is one of my favorite, and your DIY daubers. Again, you could use your regular dauber brush for this, but I'm just showing you that even if you just have stencil brushes, you can use that for this type of application. Now let's try this as a dauber to make it the edge and see how that works. That's why I like to just experiment. It's like, oh, do I have something already that I've already paid for that I don't have to buy again that will work for this application? And I like to explore and experiment. All right, again, I'm starting off the edge and then I'm just going to slowly move my way in. I'm getting brush marks. It's definitely not smooth like the other brush, but I'm getting color. So if I don't mind those brush marks, I can definitely use this as well. It's just a little bit more texture than this over here is really, really smooth. So I think the winner for, for multiple applications, I really do like these paddle brushes, I have to say. And they're not too expensive. The other thing that I think about them is that's probably better than these foam daubers is that these foam daubers do start to get worn and fall apart. And I don't know, how this will hold up, but I just feel like a brush might hold up a little bit better than the foam daubers. I think that these probably, it seems to me, would wear out a little bit quicker, start to fall apart. But jury's still out because I'm just starting to use these ones. So, and for bigger projects, I could also use this because obviously these are pretty small for a small project. But anyway, so some fun ways that you can play around with moving the pigment around, get the backgrounds. Let's try this brick one. This one's kind of thick. So I'm going to try the paddle brush and see how that works. I think that might work because even though that's thick, it's the brush bristles. I don't think that the foam daubers would work real well because I'd have to really push them in there. And I just feel like that would make it more, I'm going to try both just to see what they look like. Okay, so that's going to be the brush. I think that looks pretty cool. And now let's do down here, we'll do the dauber. Let's see how that looks. I feel like it's going to be a little bit darker and not as uniform because I kind of have to tap it in. Yeah, see, I can't really rub it because it's too deep and it's going to chew up my, I think that's going to chew up my foam. So I'm not liking that as much. I definitely think the brush works better for the deeper stencils. I covered most of the basic materials that we're going to be playing around with for the rest of the month, and hopefully sparked some interest in checking it out and seeing what we can do with these fun art toys. And, you know, maybe it's just thinking about ways that you can use them, you know, use what you already have in your art journaling or, you know, other ways. Or maybe it's something that you want to invest in. But you can always, like I said, use things that you have. I mean, I could use this as a stamp. I don't have stamps. I can make stamps out of things. So, you know, try to use what you have as much as you can first, and then add based on what you need in order to do what you love. That's what it's all about, doing what you love. And I love having choices. Sometimes it can be overwhelming to have too many choices, but I'm trying to utilize all the things that I have in my toy box as far as arts and crafts go. So I love to find new ways to use things I already have, and you know, take advantage of the multiple ways that one thing can be used. Like this can be used for paint, or this can be used for ink. So it's good to think outside the box and just play and see what happens. And then when you do a mixed media project, you have a lot more ideas that you can pull into your project and know what you can do with all the things that you have. Okay, so just a couple things that I wanted to share to follow up. I talked about how sometimes these can be difficult to have the ink stick to it, especially the water-based ink. One thing you want to do when you first get these photopolymers, or even probably the silicone too, is you want to prime the surface. And you can do that a couple different ways. You can do that with just a regular eraser. So, and this will just make it stick, because basically when you're using a water-based ink, it's water soluble. It doesn't like to stick to plastic or silicone, right? Because that's water resistant. So what happens is it'll kind of pill up, and you'll get this uneven surface. So you can use a little bit of eraser to basically make the surface a little bit stickier. You can also, what's even easier is just take your finger and just kind of rub, because sometimes there's also a little bit of, in the making of this, there's some kind of solvents or things like that that are, you know, cover the surface. So that'll make it a little bit stickier. You can also put on some embossing ink, which is clear, and you just put some on and then wipe it off. So that's a way to prime it a little bit so it works better. So I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to try with this one. I haven't primed yet. And let's just do a little demonstration. This is that 110-pound paper, so we'll see how that works too. That's that cardstock that I'm not as happy with. But I'm going to just try this stamp on this paper with a couple different inks without doing any kind of priming, and just see how it works. Now it might work a little better on, you know, with this ink than another water-based dye. I'm not sure, but let's just give it a try. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put that foam underneath just to give me a little cushion, since this doesn't have any foam on the back of it. Tap, tap, tap. And this one, see how I can see the ink on there. And I don't know if you guys can see that. Okay, can you see how there's like these little like dots? The ink is kind of dotted on there. That's that ink kind of, you know, not being even. It's sort of pulling. It's not going on evenly. So it's probably not going to be even when I lay it down, but let's just see what it looks like. Maybe it'll even itself out. All right. it's not great. It's kind of splotchy. Let's see. I'm gonna get it to focus. See how splotchy that is? There we go. That's not what I want it to look like. Okay. So I'm not going to do anything different. I'm not priming it. Now I'm going to go into Distress ink. This is also another water-based. I'm just curious to see how this one works. Tap, tap, tap. Oh, that's even worse. I don't know if you can see that, but it's even more pulled in little spots visually. How it looks on. Yeah, that doesn't look great either. So they're both kind of the same. Now let's try the pigment ink. I do like to try to keep my inks covered because it's easy to forget that they're open and then they get left open. So I try to close them immediately after I use them. Okay. Now in this case, because I have a small pad and a bigger stamp, I'm going to go ahead and do reverse. I'm going to put the stamp down and I'm going to tap my pad onto the top of that. So that's one way you can work with a smaller ink pad. It's easier to do it that way. Now you'll see just from looking at it how much more coverage I'm getting. Straight down, push, and straight up. And I'm definitely getting a more clean coverage. So that pigment ink right off the bat, even without doing any kind of priming, is just giving me a cleaner look because that glycerin is going to be a little bit stickier. There's still a little bit of splotchiness. I don't know if you can see, but definitely much better. Let's see if I can get it to there. You can kind of see it's a little bit, has a little splotchiness. Now, maybe once I do the priming, that'll change. All right, now I'm going to do the eraser technique. Now let's try the same stamps, same inks again. I'm going to start with this one since I already have it open. And I still see a few more. I still see a little bit, but I think it definitely is a little smoother than the previous one. But I do see a little bit. So maybe I didn't do it enough. I don't know. Maybe it's me. Or maybe I should prime it with that embossing ink. The embossing ink is a glycerin base, so that might make it stick a little bit better. And then I'm going to try it with the Stampin' Up. Try a little bit more. I'm just basically trying to remove any kind of solvent or anything that happened in the manufacturing process, and also just roughing the surface up a little bit because it is so shiny and clean and fresh. You can also use your finger, so maybe I'll do a little bit of both. Okay, I'm still seeing it beading up on there. It's not, definitely not as clean looking as the pigment inks. See if I get a better image. No, it's still not real clean lines compared to, see how it's kind of got like rough edges? It's just not as clean as the pigment inks. So when you're using these photopolymer or even probably the silicone's probably the same, you're probably going to want to use the pigment inks if you have a lot of those, or just accept that it's not going to be, you know, as perfect, at least, you know, crisp. I'm just not going to leave a crisp edge. Now, other brands might work better than the ones I'm trying. Now, I don't expect the Distress inks to be smooth because these aren't really designed. I mean, that's really pulling up into little, see how that's really spotty? So that's a good sign that's probably not going to come out real smooth on my page. And I tried priming these, so it's still not coming out. That's definitely the worst. It's not a bad look. Like, it's kind of cool looking, actually. I mean, if it was red, you know, for the heart, that actually is a fun effect. It's just not, you know, what I'm trying for. I want it to be smooth. So you can see the pigment inks are going to give you the better result if you're working with these photopolymers. But if you're working with the rubber, now let's look at the rubber stamp compared. You can see with that Stampin' Up! Ink with the rubber ink, look at how crisp and clean all of those details are. There's, you know, no muddiness. Now, it will say that this is on that paper that I'm not too sure about, that I think has some thickness. So, you know, maybe the edges aren't as, you know, there's maybe a little bit of some bleeding on the edges. I again think that this is not a smooth paper. So I'm going to try, because I don't trust this paper, I'm going to actually try it on. I want to do a side-by-side comparison with my favorite paper. I don't think that it's changed as far as the edge goes. I think that you know, they kind of look the same. So maybe it's fine, but they look pretty crisp and clear. I mean, this actually, these almost, and I don't know if I moved it, but this, and maybe I put a little bit more ink, but this actually looks like a thicker, almost like some of these strands look a little bit thicker. I don't know. It looks a little bit different to me, but okay. Now let's look and see what the Distress ink looks like. And again, I don't think of Distress ink as the best stamping ink, so it wouldn't be my go-to for this particular project, but maybe it'll work just fine. And again, this time I'm just tapping on it because it's smaller. You know, you can go either way. I'm going to do them on both the papers. Yeah, that one, you know, definitely seems to be a little bit more bleedy, little splotchier for sure. Especially you can see it down here. See how it's a little splotchy. So it's just the formula. It's just, you know, it's not designed for those clean lines. So I wouldn't expect that. I also want to see it on this paper. I had it half on and half off my sponge, so I'm not sure how that's going to look, but oh, I did okay. Yeah, it's definitely not as clean. It's just not as clean a look compared to the Stampin' Up! But if you want that more organic, splotchy, painterly look, it might be what you want to choose for this project. And then finally, let's just see how the pigment ink works. All right, so now let's see what this one looks like. I'm going to just move this down. I have a bigger foam mat so that I don't do what I do, like have it half on and off, but this is just part of another tool that I have. So that's a really nice, clean looking, clean edges, all around nice looking stamp. And you can see just the look of that is just crisp and vibrant. And then let's look at it on this other paper as well. So far, it's been pretty close to the same. That's real nice. I think it's a good time to wrap it up. We've done some fun stencils and stamping, trying different inks on a couple different papers, but we're going to be doing more on more papers and comparing those and trying out more technique stuff next time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me for this episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please, again, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment if you find this content helpful. And as I said before, there are links down below, so check those out. All right, thanks, everybody, and happy creating. Bye.